Well, good evening and welcome to the discussion on economy and regulation being organized as part of the month-long India Economic Forum. Of late, we've been witnessing an increased focus on creating new regulators. We have as many as 30 odd regulators and still growing, almost one is to one ratio for almost each sector of the economy. With new emerging sectors such as crypto and gaming, the need for centralization has been doubly amplified. Creation of new regulator is another challenge. Legislative and judicial backing for a regulator to have enough teeth, strong mandate, and so on. Theoretically speaking, regulation is a major way in which government influences the market economy. The scope of government regulations is vast and reaches all sectors of the economy and all aspects of our daily lives. It then becomes a primary vehicle by which the laws are implemented, which then become standards. Since the actions of the regulators have far-reaching ramifications, they have to be backed by policy analysis and should have a cost-benefit analysis element also attached to it. Because if there is uncertainty about the reach and jurisdiction of these regulators, there are some important questions that we need to answer. Amongst other, today's panel discusses and addresses how learning from GIFT as a financial regulator has been useful and how it can be scaled, how to protect the consumer interest, how to ensure that the regulator is following due process. Should all regulators have a set pattern and be structured similarly, or should regulator have judicial powers? There would be many more which the panel would like to delve on. Let me have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Dhanendra Kumar, Chairman, Competition Advisory Services and former founding Chairman, Competition Commission of India. He also served as Secretary, Defense, Road Transport and Highways and Culture. He's now heading a committee for framing national competition policy. He was conferred the SKOCH Challenger Award for his pivotal role in setting up the Competition Commission of India. Welcome, sir. Mr. Subhashish Bhadra, Director, Capital Platform Club, a fintech startup that is pioneering revenue-based financing in India. He was earlier with Omidyar Network, where he invested in both for-profit and not-for-profit entrepreneurs in the data privacy space. A Rhodes Scholar, his interest areas include data protection, internet governance, digital ID, and regulatory design. Mr. S. Vivek, Research Fellow, National Law School of India, where he is leading the Regulatory Governance Project. His practice earlier involved advising leading corporates and investment banks on structuring complex equity fundraising transactions and representing clients before high courts and the regulatory tribunals. Dr. Abha Yadav, Associate Professor, Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs. She's also Director of the Forum of Indian Regulators called FOIR, Center at IICA. Earlier, she was teaching in research and administrative experiences of more than a decade from various institutions and universities, mainly the JNU. She's an eminent scholar who has worked extensively on various legal issues globally. Mr. Anirudh Burman, Associate Research Director and Fellow, Carnegie, India. He works on key issues relating to public institutions, public administration, the administrative and regulatory state, and the state capacity. He was earlier with NIPFP and Center for Policy Research and Amarchand Mangaldas. Published works related to parliamentary oversight in India, the freedom of movement and residence, and measuring the responsiveness of independent regulators in India. Our moderator for today's show, Professor Renuka Sane from NIPFP. She has worked on areas including household finance, especially on household choices in financial instruments such as credit, pensions, insurance, and equity markets, as well as consumer protection in finance. Her research also contributed to research and policy on the criminal justice in India. She's also a member of the Pension Advisory Committee of the PFRDA. And Mr. Sameer Kochar, Reforms Historian and Chairman, SKOCH Group. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, once again. And with this, I hand over the mic to Renuka.
Thank you very much for having all of us
Can
here.
I say a
Sure.
sentence or two before we do that?
Yeah.
So thank you very much. I am really pleased to be in such august company. And since Gulsharan was calling on Renuka, the reason why we had this entire discussion itself is thanks to Renuka, because she raised this issue of regulatory cholesterol and a cost benefit analysis. We have so many regulators and we keep introducing more and more regulation, but has anyone ever done a cost benefit analysis of that? And is it, for example, if we ban all regulators, would GDP go up by 5%? Probably. I don't know. You are the experts to tell me that, but a commonsensical answer from my side would possibly be yes. You ban all the regulators and the GDP will shoot. At the same time, you need today, the way the world is moving, the way we're digitalizing, you need a light touch regulation. You need a forward-looking regulation. You need regulation that does not kill innovation, because innovation will always be ahead of regulation. So for your lack of regulating and policing ability, you cannot kill innovation. Also, areas where regulators get into implementation is a danger zone. And I see increasingly that is happening. Their job is to regulate, not to implement. One classic example over the past 4 years is regulators got into financial literacy and financial literacy got killed. Whether it is SEBI or whether it is RBI or whether they're setting up an institution as a post-retirement benefit for, let's say, a formal regulator. All the money for financial literacy for the poor of India went to an institution meant for parking spaces, regulators of India. So do that, something like that, does that bode well? I don't know. Do we need so many regulators? I don't know. What is the experience with the unified regulation? Is that something we need to do? Is that something we need to scale? How do you regulate something which is unregulatable like the crypto industry? How do you regulate something which is a sin good but essential for economic development like gaming? So there are just too many questions that are there in my mind. Fortunately, I am here in this panel only to provoke and ask some questions right at the beginning, and then I kind of bow out and defer to the much greater wisdom that Dhanindraji brings to the table, and the rest of you will do that. I hand over back to Renuka for the panel.
Thank you very much, and indeed very provocative statements, and hopefully will incite a lot of interesting discussion going forward. Before I hand over some questions to Mr. Dhanendra Kumar, I just have a couple of things to say. So I agree with what both of you have said in terms of how we have moved away from a world of central planning, what we used to call the license Raj in India. And we said that we need to open up our economy. We have to have more competition in the economy. We have to have more private sector participation in the economy. But when we brought in private sector participation, we also said, we need to have some sort of a regulation so that the private sector does not go berserk. So that was really the idea of bringing in regulation in the 90s, that we are making a break away from the institutional culture of government departments. And now we are going to these technocrats and bringing some distance between the PSU and the regulator. And we hoped that this kind of a transition would foster private investment and private dynamism. Over the last 20 years, we've seen an upsurge of regulators, as you mentioned earlier. We had the RBI from the beginning, at least in the financial sector space. We now have SEBI, IRDA, PFRDA. In other domains, we have the electricity regulators, the telecom regulator, the airport regulator, the warehousing regulator, so on and so forth. And very recently, it is possible and very likely that we may have one more regulator, which is the cross-sectional regulator in the data economy space, which is the Data Protection Authority. So there are talks about how we are going to set up a DPA in the space of privacy. What's interesting about regulators is that they combine legislative, executive, and judicial powers, and this raises a lot of questions around how you do this well. It opens up many questions that seem to have been settled when it came to the executive. So, with that background, I'll first turn to Mr. Dhanendra Kumar and ask him to tell us his views on how competition and regulation go together. Because, on the one hand, we bring in the private sector because we think that competition is going to solve all the problems, right? You don't need the state involved when you have a competitive economy. But as we are moving in the 21st century, we are also seeing that the questions of big monopolies, especially in the data space and the tech space, remain. So how do you see the interplay of competition and regulation in India?
Thank you very much for this question and also the opportunity given to me. Let me first of all extend my holy greetings to all of the panelists and also to the audience. We are meeting on the eve of Holi, and I do hope that in this atmosphere, better sense prevails in certain parts of the world, and we see cessation of hostilities in the Russia-Ukraine sector, which is so important for economy of the world. Well, friends, first of all, my sincere thanks to SKOCH Group and India Economic Forum for giving me this opportunity, and the audience also for joining on this occasion. Before I answer this specific question, let me recall the day when I joined as the chairman of the Competition Commission. I was privileged to be the first chairman. And in the first meeting I had with the industry, the minister was also present. A question was raised by a member of the audience, an industrialist. Sir, we had enough regulators, enough mothers-in-law breathing down in our neck throughout. And where was the need of adding another mother-in-law for us? And then in my answer, when I rose, I said, this mother-in-law is slightly different. She is a very loving mother-in-law whose only interest is to see you prosper and progress. And I'll explain now what I meant and how it is meant to perform. According to the preamble of the Indian competition law, it is supposed to be an act for economic development. That is the first sentence for the economic development of the country. It is the key market regulator, overarching market regulator. It is mandated to promote competition, curb anti-competitive practices, ensure level playing field for the players in the market, and thereby promote entrepreneurship, freedom of trade, innovations, infusion of technology, and thereby catalyze static, dynamic, and allocative efficiencies. So all these words are inputs for the economic development, for the accelerated economic development of the country. They are also building blocks for economic democracy. Once you open the market for new players and give them equal role to play, it is important that there is a regulator, otherwise there would be chaos and there would be a jungle raj. So the competition law envisages 3 pillars to prevent practices having adverse effect on competition, to promote and sustain competition in the market. That is the first pillar. The second one is to protect the interest of consumers. And I would say here that everybody in the market chain of things in the market is a consumer. Whether you are a producer of goods and services or you are an end consumer, you are a consumer. And to protect their interests and give them the best product and services, the cheapest price, and of the best quality is in the interest of the entire economy. And the third pillar is to ensure freedom of trade carried on by other participants in the market, which is also extremely important, that you want greater competition, you want the new entrepreneur to promote entrepreneurship all the time, dynamically, and enter and promote production. India was a relatively late entrant in the community of competition regulators in the world when it replaced MRTP. It was a relic of socialist era when it was opened. And at that time, there were 120 or so competition regulators in the world. Right now, I believe there are 141 regulators. Abha would know much better. As the players in the market vie with one another for the custom of the consumer, the competition brings about allocative and production efficiencies, brings down prices for the consumers, infusion of new technologies, new products, and to bring into the market newer products in a dynamic way, and thereby we say that it leads to static and dynamic efficiencies. In the current phase of globalization, enterprises have to compete with the best in the world. India being a large and attractive market global players are attracted here in accordance with the country's FDI policies, which are very liberal. Most of the MNCs and global players have set up their operations here, intensifying the competition. Likewise, Indian companies can also compete in the global arena, bringing to the Indian consumers globally competitive products and services. The objective of the competition law are further reflected in various provisions of the Act. Under Section 18 of the Act, CCI is mandated to act suo motu, and same is reflected in various other sections. Section 19.3, where CCI looks at what is there for the consumers if there is an anti-competitive agreement. Section 19.4, dependence of consumers for the dominance, and 19.6 and 7, where the definition of geographic market and product market is determined by various factors, including consumer preference. I'm mentioning this because there was a mention about consumers. Even the Honorable Supreme Court of India, in the Competition Commission of India versus Steel Authority of India, which is a landmark case, the first case of 2010, which elaborated on various functions of the Competition Commission. It dwelt on this thing and mentioned that CCI is supposed to look after the interest of the consumers, and it is invested with inquisitorial, adjudicatory, and investigative powers for that matter. It is not a judicial body, and I'll mention it towards the end of my talk. Then competition as a tool brings various benefits to the consumers. It, as I said, it means lowering of prices and improving quality because the productivity also increases. They want to bring down the prices. They want to bring down the newer products with new technologies, and thereby employment also increases. And we see that in Indian context, there have been a splurge of startups and unicorns also. Then it leads to consumer empowerment because of promotion of factors, which leads to higher degree of consumer protection, freedom of individual choices. Choice is extremely important single word for the competition law, choice for the consumers, abhorrence of concentration of power, and decentralized economic efficiency. The allocative efficiency is also increased because there is allocation of resources where there is greater productivity. It leads to better and wider choices for the consumers, as I said. There is also a provision which is not so widely known. Competition law provides for compensation under Section 53N by the appellate tribunal if any enterprise feels that they have suffered loss or damage and they can prove it as a result of contravention of the competition law by any enterprise. Another important provision which is not widely known is Section 32 of the Act, where Commission has got powers to review actions taking place outside India but having effect on markets in India, whereby CCI can look at those actions and take various corrective actions. And when Indian enterprises suffer from global cartels, then enterprises can also file cases in those jurisdictions, in London, for example, or in Europe, for recoveries of damage in the market in India. CCI has entered into agreement with several competition jurisdictions across the world, and this leads to the possibility of their getting into situations when they can talk to those competition jurisdictions and get their assistance in ensuring market corrections. Competition is a life force of markets and creates an ecosystem for increasing efficiency, productivity, and innovation. A healthy competition does not emerge on its own without oversight and necessary intervention. As I said, there would be chaotic environment and which could drive up prices, let's say by cartels or dominant firms can misuse their market power, fence out competition. CCI as the market regulator has been dynamically changing the regime in accordance with the evolving market realities. And so far, it has taken action in 1,100 cases of antitrust brought out before them, and also reviewed 900 plus mergers and acquisition cases to ensure that they don't lead to any market distortions. They have taken action in various sectors like airlines, banking, capital markets, e-commerce, digital markets, financial sector, real estate, pharmaceuticals, and so on and so forth. It uses an effective mix of twin instruments of enforcement and advocacy, and this is used in a calibrated manner. They also undertake market studies like what they have done in e-commerce or pharma or telecom, which also helps in market corrections. One important feature in the competition law, not so widely known, is the equal treatment of the private and public sector in the eyes of competition law under Section 2H of the Act. In fact, even the government departments, not only the PSUs, they are also subject to the powers of the CCI to ensure that the market serves in accordance with the tenets of the competition law. As we are entering into the data-based market economics, there are a number of features which are important to ensure that CCI takes action when there is a distortion due to data-based application and services and technology-led convergence across the value chain, which is evident in a number of cases which are still going on before the CCI, and I wouldn't like to dwell upon that because of the paucity of time. There is a difference between competition policy and competition law, and there was a reference to the national competition policy, which I was involved in a few years ago. And the competition policy is a wider term, which includes various actions by the government, which are infusion of the principles of competition principles and adding to the overall competition efficiency, consumers' welfare, which leads to the consumer surplus and producer surplus, and also enhances the taxes collected by the government. So therefore, for an inclusive and resilient economy, it's important that competition law and policy, which also establishes economic justice as enshrined in the preamble of the Constitution of India, is enhanced. Competition is always considered as an essential handmaiden of efficient trade and a watchdog of consumer welfare. Now, there were a few areas which were mentioned by Gursharan ji, and I'll briefly allude to some of them. Should all regulators have a set pattern and structured similarity? I would say that all the regulators are governed by their statutes, like CCI by the competition law, RBI by the RBI Act, SEBI by the SEBI Act, and so on. They have to function according to the architecture of those acts. They cannot deviate from them, and generally the welfare in accordance with the Constitution of India is the guiding principle. There is no one-size-fits-all solution in actions of all the regulators. It has to function according to the demands of the statute, legislative intent, legal reasoning, and implementation. Another question was, should regulator have judicial powers? As I mentioned, in the case of competition law, the Supreme Court has enacted in 2010 what are the powers of the Supreme Court, and it has been completely demarcated, and it is not a judicial body. It's at best you can call it a quasi-judicial body, but it's supposed to be investigative and inquisitorial, and to an extent adjudicatory also. The third question was, should regulation and rule making be divorced? Now, again, this is something which I would say that the regulators are supposed to formulate their own regulations, which is in accordance with the Act, and CCI has been doing it very successfully in consultation with the stakeholders. There was one more question, should there be a mechanism for resolution of disputes among regulators? Normally, everyone knows what is its jurisdiction, and Supreme Court and High Courts they play a greater role there. In the case of Bharti Airtel versus CCI, for example, Supreme Court resolved the jurisdictional conflict between TRAI and CCI when it said that CCI has a follow-on jurisdiction in cases having competition law concern. There was one more question: should there be training for regulators? Certainly, yes, there should be a training. They should always be capacity building at all levels. And there was last and final question: should there be what lessons should be there for a new regulator? As I said right in the beginning, there was a comment in the beginning: is there a need of another mother-in-law? A regulator is good if it adds to the economic efficiency and doesn't add to the cholesterol. So basically, any regulation is meant to achieve certain objectives in the scheme of things of economic development, and to the extent it adds to that, and there is facilitation also, and I didn't want to elaborate for paucity of time how CCI in its scheme of things has facilitated its regulation and is constantly talking to all the stakeholders, like for example a green channel it has introduced in the case of M&A and so on. So in conclusion, I would say that competition law is considered to be a friend of the market. CCI is supposed to make sure that all the stakeholders and consumers, they act in accordance with the architecture of the law to further the economic development of the country. And it is doing so. I'm glad to say that. And once again, I would say that for paucity of time, I'm not able to answer the questions, but I'll be happy to answer the questions if Gurusharanji writes to me later any questions which emanate out of the discussion. And my sincere thanks to you, Sameerji, for giving me this opportunity, and Gurusharanji, and all the panelists. I won't be able to listen to you, but I'll listen to the recording later once I come back from this meeting at 4 o'clock. Thank you so much indeed. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for those very interesting and insightful comments. And I think they segue nicely into some of the questions that get raised as we think about regulation and the economy. And since you began with competition, I want to, before we go into the process of regulation making, I want to ask Shubhashish a question, because he's been working in the digital economy space. And I want to ask you your reflections on how these issues of regulating competition have arisen in the digital economy space, and how do you think that regulation should address some of the concerns in terms of tech monopolies or digital platforms?
Now, I know I'm not being very courteous to the next speaker, but the board meeting is supposed to begin at 4 o'clock. If you permit me, I'll take your leave, and I'll like to listen the recording. Gurusharanji, if you share with me later. My apologies, I'll have to leave.
Sure.
In fact, a couple of questions already came in for you, so we'll share them with you.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Shubhashish, back to you.
Renko, thank you for your question, and certainly a very insightful set of comments to get us started today. To your question of competition in the digital economy, clearly, I'm sure all of us would agree that there needs to be a fundamentally different way of looking at it, and previous modes of looking at competition are not necessarily applicable to the digital economy. To start with, for example, we've historically, competition has often been seen in this notion of consumer surplus or consumer welfare, but in the context of zero-priced platforms and things like that, it raises the natural question of how do you even A, measure it, but B, is it really the only standard that you should be applying? Should you be looking, as Leena Khan argues, at the market structure impact of these platforms, etc.? So all of that to say that obviously we have to look at it in fundamentally different ways. To your question, therefore, of regulating digital markets, and we are at this point as club also part of the fintech ecosystem, and we also want to become a platform of a kind. So it's certainly a question that we've thought a lot about. I think there are as Tandem Research has done a lot of work on digital platforms, and they've basically identified 4 characteristics of these new age digital platforms. And as we think about regulating them from a competition perspective, I think we have to start from first principles, which is to articulate what is the market failure and therefore what is the need for regulation that is arising. I think the previous decades thought process around regulation might not necessarily be applicable here. So what are these 4 characteristics and 4 markers? Firstly, there's network effects. The way we see network effects played out in the digital economy are fundamentally much stronger. It's very difficult for us, if all of our friends are on WhatsApp, to certainly choose to be on Signal. So that has an impact on competition in a very fundamental way, in a way that didn't in most cases happen before. So then we have to look at first principles solving of that kind of a problem, saying that therefore, for example, should we have interoperability of platforms such that someone on Signal should be able to text someone on WhatsApp, or someone on Uber should be able to book a cab on Ola, etc. Because that fundamentally then gets rid of that kind of competitive advantage, which really favors incumbents and prevents the emergence of potentially newer forms of service. Secondly, the infrastructural role they play. It is now well known that a lot of these platforms have become infrastructures, and therefore they can actually play God, which is depending on who they give access to and who they don't give access to. They're fundamentally shaping the competitive landscape of a lot of these sectors. And therefore, if they are actually opining on who wins in a so-called competitive market, I think there is a certain amount of regulation and transparency that is required there. Thirdly, database models. The fact that all of these platforms in the digital world are data-based, I think we need to have a wider conversation on how do we regulate the use and extraction of data. And of course, there is now increasing regulations in different countries coming forth about how these platforms should not be able to differentially privilege themselves in the use of the data that they collect from certain categories of actors on their marketplaces. And finally, one thing we have to recognize, though it's not necessarily in the competition domain, is down these platforms aren't just economic platforms, they're also civic platforms. So as we think about regulating these platforms, we won't only be talking about competition and economic issues, we will also be talking about civic issues, and that is also something that we have to keep at the back of our minds. So long answer to your short question, Renuka. Clearly, fundamentally different ways of looking at it are required, and therefore even articulating what is the policy or what is the policy stance across different regulators, because this is something that's going to cut across competition, data, financial services, etc., is what is required.
So thanks, Shubhashish. And you raised 2 points which lead me to my 2 next questions. You kind of pointed out that we need to first understand first principles and say, why do we need regulation and what is the purpose of a specific regulation? What is the problem that we are trying to solve? I want to ask Anirudh that, Anirudh, you have done work on the process of regulation making as it should be applied in theory and as it is applied often in practice in various regulatory agencies in India. So can you kind of tell us a little bit about what is a good regulation making process and what are you seeing across various regulators in India that perhaps needs to be changed or we need to do better, or perhaps something that is good that we need to reinforce in other agencies as well? So how do you see the process of regulation making?
Thanks, Renuka, and it's a pleasure to be here and discussing this issue with this panel. On the process of regulation making, you're right, there is a vast difference between what best practices require and how Indian regulators practice regulation making. And there's been some work done in India, some work that I've been glad to be part of that's talked about using some of these best practices. And a lot of that has been basically focused around creating a good process so that the regulator can actually consult with stakeholders, do an economic impact analysis or a regulatory impact analysis, and have a deliberative and consultative process for regulation making. So every regulator should ideally first at least set out a draft of the regulation that they are going to planning to implement, along with some kind of explanatory document that sort of gives the context to what this regulation seeks to do, what is the kind of problem it seeks to solve, what will this regulation do in terms of actually trying to solve that problem, And it should have some kind of a cost benefit analysis or a regulatory impact analysis that tries to explain what is it that this regulation will do in terms of its impact on different kinds of stakeholders. Will it be a net benefit for society or not? And in this, it should be able to actually compute not just the costs of direct compliance, but also indirect costs on different kinds of stakeholders. And ideally, this should be done for at least a considerable period of time, because the regulation is going to have this impact on society for a while. So it's a much more deliberative process than how we do regulation making today. When the regulator puts out all this information, it should obviously give some time to the public for uh, placing its comments to the regulator. And then the regulator should at least put out some kind of a statement or a response to the comments that they have received. And it's only after that that the regulator should ideally decide on what the final regulation should look like. So it's a very different process from how we do regulation making today in most regulators. There are some exceptions who do better, but this is not what is happening today. And what following this process means is that regulation making would actually become a much more slower, more consultative, more evidence-based process. And it's not a guarantee that the regulator would still have the right answers at the end of the process, but we at least create the opportunities that you are getting more information, getting more feedback, creating more evidence about what that regulation is going to do. So you create those opportunities for getting feedback and for also for providing more information to stakeholders. They know how the regulator is thinking about these issues, what they're planning to do. It creates some kind of predictability in the market, reduces uncertainty in the market. So following this kind of process has a lot of benefits. Unfortunately, in India, we don't have a uniform standard or a set of rules that require regulators to do this. Like Mr. Dhanendra Kumar was saying, every regulator is governed by their own statute, and they have very different standards. So some regulators are required to follow a consultative process, others are not. And the regulators that are required to do so do better on this consultative process, whereas others don't. But the big gap in India so far is that almost no one does an economic impact analysis of the regulations at all. So that's something that needs to be fixed, but we also need a lot more consistency in the actual procedure for all regulators.
Let me follow that up with a different style of regulator that we are possibly building, which is the gift model of regulation that was mentioned at the start of this panel as well, where it seems that we have created a more unified model of regulation as opposed to silos in the financial sector that we have in India. What's your sense of how differently has GIFT been structured on the question of regulation making? So, it's one thing to say that the objective and what it can and cannot do is different, but in the how it does anything, are you seeing something that is different from how we do regulation making in other parts of India?
So I'm not fully conversant with the structure of GIFT. What I do understand is that certain laws are exempted from their application within GIFT City. And the idea is to have an international financial center that's far more liberal than the rest of the country. And I think that does have certain advantages because it exempts certain aspects of finance from regulatory oversight and supervision. So the advantage is that we have fewer laws applying within GIFT City. On the process of regulation making, my understanding is that most of it remains the same. I think the advantage for regulated entities was possibly that there is a unified regulator, there is no regulatory fragmentation, they are talking to the same people. And through that, I think they'll have a better chance to understand how the regulator is thinking, which is always a problem when we have multiple regulators.
That's very interesting. Shubhashish, as a regulated entity, Anirudh raised a lot of points on process of regulation making, consultation, doing a CBA. You are at the receiving end of some of this, right, as a regulated entity. What's your sense of how you see the process of regulation making, and what difference would it make to you as a business and to the community as a whole, not just to you, where we could we could truly reduce the cost of doing business in India? And how can better regulation making help? How do you see this?
Thank you for the question, Renuka. Look, I think the context that we have to all be aware of as citizens, rather than regulated or non-regulated entities, is that we are emerging from a pandemic-induced economic slowdown. We obviously want to be an innovation hub in the country, and there's always this tension and open question mark about the tension between innovation and regulation. And I don't think it needs to be an either or. So the question becomes, how do you get innovation with regulation and regulation with innovation? From a perspective of startups, I think there are two things that are extremely important. One is predictability. The worst thing you can do to a startup, because startups are anyway dealing with so much unpredictability at a fundamental business model level, is to have regulatory uncertainty almost stack up on that. And therefore, building on the point that Anirudh made about putting these draft instruments out in the public, making sure that everyone has the chance to review and provide comments to those draft instruments are really important. Again, drawing on the paper that Anirudh has written, that in regulators where it is put down in their parent legislation that they must do this process, we see that 40 to 50% of the instruments go through such a process, whereas for those where it is not mentioned, we see anywhere in the single digits. So I think that becomes really important from the perspective of a regulated entity, so that you know a few months in advance whether you are going to be subject to a regulation and what kind of regulation. But just predictability is not enough, because you might be able to predict a bad regulation, and that's not the situation we want to be in. And the perspective that a young entrepreneur sitting in Bangalore will have might be very different from what a bureaucrat sitting in Delhi might have. And I'm not saying either is the right perception, but one has to find that middle ground, or at least create those channels for that conversation to happen. And therefore, I actually want us to go back, or at least reflect on the very fundamentals of nation building, which is that what we have to make sure is that any kind of intervention in markets be minimal and be responsive to a market failure. What we have to avoid is over-regulation, and how you avoid over-regulation is making sure that the parent legislations are very, very tightly drafted. What we see, for example, even in the regulatory governance right now, is very often, even a regulator might only be allowed to bring out regulations, but they instead also bring out circulars and master circulars and whatnot, which have no legal basis in the parent statute. So from the perspective of the innovation economy, the reason that becomes really important is because you want to make sure that the interventions in the innovation economy are minimal, that when those interventions happen, they are based on a written law of the land. And you also, therefore, introduce a certain amount of fairness in it, in the sense that any regulator should not just be free to bring any regulation that it chooses to bring, but actually derive it from some of the statutes that were drawn. So to therefore summarize my intervention, I would say that what really matters to the innovation economy is this notion of predictability and this notion of fairness.
Thank you, Shubhashish. I think this process of regulation making is one aspect of what makes a good regulator. But then the second aspect is really the question of enforcement. Once you have made these regulations, you then are going to enforce some of these on the regulated entities. And here, Vivek, I know you have done some work on the question of enforcement. So I'd like you to come in and tell us a little bit about how you see the enforcement processes at regulators, both from a design perspective in terms of questions of separation of power and in terms of implementation. What are the challenges that you are seeing in the way we are doing enforcement in India?
Thanks very much, Renuka. So on the question of enforcement, I think the focus in India so far has very much been, like you said, on the question of on separation of powers, which is, can a regulator, which is generally seen as an executive wing of the government, can they adjudicate, can they give compensation, and so on. But the heart of the matter, although, is what is the most effective way of implementing the regulations? And that honestly should be the framework with which regulators look at enforcement. Unfortunately, what's happened in India is the tools that government generally has, which is to impose penalties, put people in jail, They've just taken that and sort of, handed that over to independent regulators. So it doesn't matter whether it's an environment protection regulator, whether it's a securities regulator, it's the RBI. They all have pretty much similar tools to tackle vastly different types of regulated entities and to achieve very different goals. So what, from the enforcement perspective, we've seen is that regulators themselves sometimes feel that what the statute has given them is insufficient. So if the statute says that you can impose penalties and they're constantly seeing people not affected by penalties, they are then forced to come up with innovative remedies on their own, which as a general matter, as Subhashi said, is bad from a rule of law perspective. You don't want to give that kind of discretion to an unelected official, even with the best of intentions. So what we need from the enforcement perspective is a fundamental rethink from the drafting of the laws to say, if I'm, let's say, drafting a real estate legislation, what exactly do I want to achieve through that? And based on that, frame your enforcement strategies and have guiding principles for the officials who are implementing the various provisions of the law, so that they also know what strategy to use in what situation. So I think to just sum it up, I'd say that I think from an enforcement perspective, what we have is regulators tackling 21st century problems with essentially sort of 19th, 20th century tools. And it's no surprise, therefore, that we frequently say that they're not achieving the goals for which they were set up.
Very often we hear that regulators complain about lack of independence, or we hear about people complain that regulators are not effective because they actually lack independence, and that independence is one of the core features of a good regulatory setup. So, here I'd like to call upon all of you. Maybe Abha, we can begin with you on how you see the question of independence of regulators. How important that is, and in your view, how is independence best designed?
Thank you, Renuka, and it's been an absolute pleasure listening to all the panelists. Am I audible? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So, a lot of, since I'm, I think, the last speaker on the panel, of course, we will be cross-talking, but a lot of food for thought. And before I answer your question pertaining to independence of regulators, Renuka, one thing that we need to understand when we talk of regulators is that beyond what you said earlier in your opening remarks, about the three pillars of democracy, you mentioned legislature, executive, judiciary, and then we have a fourth entity, so to speak, a regulator. So now, what was the need for a regulator when these three entities already existed? I think one needs to start from there, so that we arrive at the issue of the role of a regulator to determine predetermined policy, to sort of achieve predetermined policy objectives, and of course mostly those are to maintain competitive conditions in the market. Whereas on the other hand, when we talk of policy makers, so here I'm trying to draw a difference, a distinction between policymakers and regulation and regulatory processes, because policymakers' role is to provide long-term objectives and to develop the vision for the country. Of course, policymakers may issue policy guidelines, like I think Mr. Dhanendra Kumar was trying to tell us that, he is with the national competition policy of the country, whereas the CCI is the regulator that ends up executing and implementing the spirit of the national competition policy. So I think that is very important. And why I'm mentioning this is also because it's equally important to ensure that the regulator's domain is not encroached upon by the government. So I think here we can say that we are touching upon your question of independence. Because in the name of achieving those policy objectives, sometimes a regulator is just an extension of the ministry, which sort of created it. And then, of course, the entire regulatory design, the regulation making process, because, sometimes the regulator is just handed a statute. It, of course, is established under a statute. So the TRI has the TRI Act, the CRC, that is the electricity commissions, are all under statutes. All regulators are under statutes. So this is a rule book. This is a legislative rule book which is handed over to them, and within those four walls and frameworks, they have to function. So we need, first of all, to have a clear distinction between policy and regulation in the country, which I find is often missing. So, because then that would lead us to the next question of independence and so on and so forth. Then, of course, I think, again, coming from, because competition law is something I work very closely with, and a lot of points were coming to my mind when Mr. Dhanendra Kumar was speaking. Because you see, when we talk of the Competition Act, which he mentioned Section 18 of the Act, and the Section 18 says, eliminate practices having adverse effect on competition and so on and so forth. So that there is promotion and sustainable competition culture in the country, and you protect the interests of the consumers, you ensure freedom of trade and so on and so forth. Now, this being the mandate of the Competition Commission of India, I think we need to have, and especially the researchers and the students of the area, we all need to have a bird's eye view of all the regulators also, because some of us know, some of you will be surprised to know that mostly, if you see, the broad declaration of competition goals also exists with other regulators. To give you an example, the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India Act mandates the TRAI to take measures to facilitate competition and to promote efficiency in the operation of telecommunication services. So here I'm trying to touch upon the entire cross-sectoral issues also. Similarly, if you see the PNGRB Act 2006, the Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board Act, it requires the Petroleum and Natural Gas Regulatory Board to foster fair trade and competition. So there are these sectoral laws, what I'm trying to say, that outline the competition jurisdiction with far greater specificity. And they use legislative language. And then, of course, we have a Competition Commission of India, the antitrust regulator of the country, which is supposed to maintain free and fair market, to assure that there is market correction that happens from time to time. Also, the Electricity Act 2003. It empowers the Central Electricity Regulatory Commission to issue directions to a licensee if it enters into any agreement or abuses its dominant position or enters into a combination which is likely to cause or causes an adverse effect on competition. So this is exactly a term which you would find in the antitrust law, the Competition Act also. So this is a food for thought, that is the Competition Act ill-designed, in situations of conflict, which jurisdiction will prevail. And of course, Section 60 of the Competition Act does have a non-obstante clause, which gives an overriding effect to the Act. But there is also the clause, the Section 62, which talks about the fact that the Competition Act should be read in harmony with other statutes. So it's really a very ambiguous area. And then, of course, there's judicial intervention, wherein, we have had cases where, the trial, let's say, to give you an example of a case which of 2017, and many more cases where the Delhi High Court quashed the CCI's probe into cartelization by the telecom companies on the ground that the issue fell within the exclusive jurisdiction of the telecom regulator TRAI. So I'm just trying to set the base for the independence of a regulator, number one. Independence vis-a-vis what? Independence vis-a-vis the government. But then within the regulators also, there's so much confusion when it comes to sectoral regulators who are trying to maintain competition, and so many other mandates which their respective statute gives to them. And then, of course, they have to deal with the Competition Commission of India, and there are jurisdictional issues. And I gave you an example of how the court intervention also takes place. So within this framework, I feel that it's very important to look at the independence issue, which you asked me to focus on. And in today's times, we find that regulators want to be independent, of course, but you see that there is so much of intervention, policy-wise and even otherwise, in day-to-day areas that is taking place from their respective ministries. So how to sort of, get away from that, remains to be seen. So that is my 2 bit on the independence issue.
Thank you, Abha. By bringing in the point about regulatory coordination and how different regulators deal with each other and with a similar issue, I think you've raised another. But let me come to that question a little later, because I think it's extremely important. And but come back to this issue of independence and ask the other panelists. Maybe Vivek, you want to jump in here and tell us how you see this question of independence, and do you think independence by itself is enough? You might end up with a very independent and powerful regulator, but then the other issues that we spoke about, such as regulation making and enforcement, may be missing. So how do you see these issues in terms of designing a good regulator?
Thanks, Renuka. And I think this, like the Abha was also saying, I think this is a very critical question. And somehow in India, I think we sort of take it for granted that regulators must necessarily, within quotes, be independent. So what exactly do we mean by that? I think two central questions that we need to have some sense of is independent from whom and for what reason. Initially, I guess when regulators were set up, there was a crying need for the government to establish their legitimacy, to say that, look, these are technocratic folks who are going to take decisions very quickly. It's not going to be like the license permit Raj kind of era. So we actually are not going to touch them. They will make technocratic decisions on the basis, relying on experts. So they will be independent from the day-to-day political machinations which may influence government departments. It's debatable whether that was a sound footing to even set up regulators. There are very important, very senior bureaucrats who believe that government departments could have done the same thing if you insulated them from political influence. But be that as it may, it at least gave them some legitimacy in the eyes of various stakeholders. But where we are today is very different from the early 90s, when these regulators were also sort of starting up and newly set up. Today we are in a circumstance where regulators ordinarily perform both legislative and executive functions. And in legislative functions, they don't just detail out something the act says. So it's not that they say, oh, please file this in 30 days, or the director must sign as opposed to so and so, but they actually make policy. They say that these kinds of companies can be licensed, these kinds of companies cannot be licensed, which is a really important power. Similarly with the executive function, and many regulators also have quasi-judicial functions. So at this stage, I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is, when in the normal wings of government, legislature, executive and judiciary, which perform only one function usually, we subject them to a series of limitations, both under the constitution and under various statutes. So for the legislature, we say you're going to face elections. But when the regulator makes these policies, the regulations are being made by unelected officials. And tabling regulations before Parliament is just really not a feasible solution for both the volume and both the granularity of regulations. There's no way Parliament can even keep up. And in the executive side, we find that in the executive wing of government generally is subject to Parliament in terms of political accountability, subject to judicial review. Its money comes based on what the legislature approves. And here again, we see that many regulators actually raise their own money. So, and they aren't accountable to anyone to say why they initiated investigations against someone, why they chose not to, what process they follow. And similarly for the quasi-judicial element as well. So what penalties they levy, what remedies they offer. There's the statute is usually framed in such a broad way. And since you raised GIFT City, the International Financial Services Authority, the regulation making power section says that they can make any regulation to achieve the objectives of the act. So in this circumstance, even the most well-meaning regulator who wants to do all the things we discussed, to ensure that there's a net benefit, all of that, there is absolutely no guidance that comes from the statute to tell them that this is the way you need to achieve the goals that we've identified. So when we say regulatory independence, somehow it seems to have become a garb for escaping accountability in some way, and that's something that we need to think about seriously. And some of the coordination problems Abha mentioned also perhaps have a root in this, that each regulator sees that area as its own fiefdom, as opposed to the central government deciding that this method of regulation is the best suited for that particular area. So there's no question of two regulators fighting with each other, saying that this is my area, you don't come in. So I think the idea of regulatory independence, even if it started off with the best of intentions, today where we are is that it seems to be used to escape accountability. And this is not just an Indian issue. And, this is a global issue. Everybody is struggling with this. Just last year, in the UK, two important parliamentary reports were given on delegated legislation, which said that, the UK Parliament has fought for centuries to have the power it has today. And what they find now is most of the laws that actually affect people are being made by delegated legislation, by regulators or by unelected officials. So where does that leave Parliament? And they, of course, they've recommended certain things, but largely they've said that we need to be innovative about different forms of accountability for the 21st century, because these forms of regulations are here to stay. And we need to be more intentional about how we design regulators. We can't just say make regulations as you see fit to achieve the objectives, but we need to be a bit more proactive in telling regulators also on how they should achieve the goals that's been identified.
Excellent.
May I please add a point?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, just two quick points as to what Vivek said. One is, I think when we talk of independence of regulators, we need to ask ourselves, independence from what? I mean, are we escaping accountability? Are we not going to be transparent? Are we, the holier than thou? So that, I think, is the quintessential question here, Renuka, that Vivek talked about delegated legislation. So is the parliament trying to evade its responsibility, the day-to-day functioning, and then, thereby just, establish a regulator in a sector and then hands off? That is one thing, a very layman's, sort of perspective, if I were to give you that. And the second point, of course, about independence, one also needs to see that, are we independent really from each other? So the regulators also need to sit together and have a conversation. I think that is most important. The regulators need to discuss with each other as to what are their jurisdictional issues, what are their other kinds of policy matters that probably a fine-tuning amongst them would help the entire economic structure to function better.
Okay, I mean, this is fantastic. I think lots of, points for us to think about how to make existing regulators better. And before we kind of segue into thinking about how to make new regulators better or how to increase institutional capacity, I thought that we could just look at some of the questions that have come from the audience, try and answer them, and before we move on to the second part of our discussion. So Abha, here's a question for you. It says that regulatory compliance is a challenge for businesses of all scales in India, but the problem becomes more challenging for smaller businesses. So can there be better technology-enabled mechanisms to track and manage compliance requirements? So do you have something to say on that?
Yes, and thank you for the question. And I think a lot of regulators, since I work closely also with CARC, so technology, they've really, latched on to technology and used it in their daily functioning. A lot of AI is being used. A lot of blockchain is being used. That is one part, of course. Now, one is service delivery. One is, the service delivery part of a regulator. To make sure that the regulated entity is number one within the framework of the regulator, within its policy framework, and also that the service delivery is happening and market correction is happening from time to time. So there I have found that they are all also trying to, in fact, the CCI always does these market studies. It takes up, it asks the think tanks, it asks IICA, it asks so many other the big fours to do a market study for them so that they can come up with better and better solutions to the regulatory framework that they have. So I think there's a lot of thought that is going on within the regulatory sphere as far as technological advances and using them is concerned. And I think the gift city also, we may debate it endlessly, but the fact is that has also come up because of certain deep thinking that has taken place. What will eventually happen, of course, time will tell.
Thanks, Abha. So, Shubhashish, here's a question for you. There are increasing concerns that the telecom market in India might become a duopoly. There have already been steep tariff hikes in the past 2 years by major telecom players. What does it mean for customers, and can there be any regulatory interventions to stop this from happening?
Thanks for the question, Renuka. So look, again, we have to understand what kind of market failure is arising here, and therefore what is the best intervention possible. So clearly, the fact that there is stress in the telecom sector means somewhere in the past the regulation has gone wrong, and I think the fact that there has been intervention in the pricing of all of this is something that we should be aware of. I think that is also true across other regulators as well. Even if we see in electricity and we see in other places, I think this intervention in pricing decisions of the private sector, in the absence of any obvious market failure, is something that one has to reflect on. Of course, one might also say that, having access to telecom or telecom services or internet services essentially some sort of a fundamental right, which therefore must be made accessible to people. But even in that case, we have to really put out that cost benefit analysis before we actually bring any kind of price restricting regulation in place. So for example, for all we know, we might discover that the best way to actually address this problem is not so much to regulate every private sector player's prices, but it is to have some sort of public provider who's going to absorb the losses and actually make good on the kind of social elements of providing this. So therefore, the answer, just to kind of put it all together, I do think in general, as almost a philosophy, I'm kind of anti tinkering around with prices, but in cases that it is felt necessary, there has to be a very valid legal ground for it to be a necessity. So in this case, are we actually articulating that the access to telecom services is some sort of fundamental right which you want to make sure? Or B, to say that, look, because the benefit of everyone having telecom in the country is going to be so high that it's going to outweigh the stresses it puts on the sector, therefore we are going to do it. And B, choosing the right instrument to do it, and is price ceilings really the right instrument? So all of that to say that I think we do need to, clearly given the stress in the sector, need to look at things very afresh.
Thanks a lot, Shubhashish. With this, I want to move on to where we are headed next in terms of setting up of new regulators. So one of the new regulators that is likely to come up that we've been talking about for many years now is the Data Protection Authority. And here, Anirudh, I'd like to ask you for your views on what should the government be thinking about as it sets up a new regulator, given what we have learned from the mistakes or the lacunae in the way existing regulators function?
So, Renuka, the Data Protection Authority is going to be responsible for enforcing this personal data protection bill. It's not yet a law, it's still pending in Parliament. There's been a report by the Joint Parliamentary Committee, and I think the government is considering it. The bill itself basically requires companies who collect data to take the consent of all users and to give them notice about their collection of data. And it also requires them to have a lot of compliance requirements with regard to how they actually use this data, the safety of the data, security, and so on. And it also gives consumers the right to have access to this data, to get it corrected if there are errors in it, to port this data from one company to another, and so on. So this is going to apply on an economy-wide scale across different sectors of the economy. And the Data Protection Authority will be the regulator that's in charge of enforcing and monitoring the application of this law. So I think it's fairly obvious to state that the remit of the DPA will be probably one of the largest for any regulator in India. And it's something that we've not done before, we've not had before. And it's going to be a kind of unprecedented development because we don't have any prior experience of this kind of data protection regulation. So currently, sectoral regulators do a bit of data protection regulation. So RBI will have some regulations on how consumer data should be kept by credit information companies and so on and so forth, and by other entities who collect consumer data. Similarly, SEBI and IRDA will have these kinds of requirements. But there has been no regulation on a cross-sectoral scale. So the mandate of the DPA is going to be pretty enormous, and we don't have any prior experience of this kind of regulation. The other challenge, of course, is that by its very nature, data and data regulation is going to look at a highly innovative, highly dynamic sector of the economy. Data is probably the driving point for most innovation occurring today. And the DPA is going to be regulating the use and collection of data. So I think this point was made earlier also, that regulators are usually behind the market. And then there is a risk of regulators either over-regulating or under-regulating. This is an added problem in the data sphere because A, the market is highly innovative, and B, the DPA is going to be that much more restrained or constricted in its ability to capture information about the market because of the nature of innovation. So it's going to pose many problems for the DPA just because of the nature of the market, the nature of the ecosystem. And then we've given this expansive mandate to the DPA, which itself is going to be a problem. So there are reasons to be worried about how efficacious this DPA's regulation is going to be going forward, which in turn requires us to think strategically about what it is the DPA should be doing in its first 3, 4, 5 years. What are the 3 big things or the 5 big things it should be focusing on, rather than trying to spread its net far and wide and to try and regulate everything, because that's just not possible. And so are there possibilities for coordinating with other regulators and focusing on sectors that are unregulated, for example, right? Or are there possibilities for looking at only vulnerable sections of the society rather than to look at the entire population when it comes to looking at the use and collection of their data? So these are strategic choices that the DPA will have to make. And these are some things that will need to be considered carefully by parliamentarians as well, because right now the provisions in the bill are very similar to what is given in the provisions for other legislation regulators in their legislation, which is you have about 35-40 functions that have been given to the DPA with no sense of prioritization or strategic kind of approach. And it is then left to the DPA's discretion to try and translate this. The problem with this, of course, is that when something goes wrong, then the DPA is faced with the task of justifying what it was doing and what it was not doing in that space. So even though the DPA will have to, by necessity, strategize and prioritize on some functions, if something goes wrong, it will also have to defend itself saying, no, I was doing something on another aspect as well. And that's going to create a problem, and which is why I think this tension between independence and accountability is going to be much more visible in the case of the DPA, because of the wide remit of the mandate and also the kind of impossibility of actually fulfilling that from its very inception. So we need to think about whether we can actually infuse this bill at this stage with some sense of prioritization, or whether we can reduce the mandate, whether we can actually give some clear directions to the DPA saying focus on areas that are not currently regulated by sectoral regulators, right? Or whether we can say you have to create a risk-based assessment and you have to basically regulate as per that assessment rather than to regulate the entire market and be responsible for that. So I think those are some of the things we need to think about.
Fair enough. Sorry,
yeah.
Abha, I was just going to come to you. And so maybe let me ask the question and then you can sort of take the question and add whatever you were sort of commenting on what Anirudh had said. I think Anirudh raises an important point in terms of the difficulty of the mandate of the DPA to begin with. Now, one of the things that we've struggled with respect to other regulators is regulators often turn around and say that We've never been trained to do a cost benefit analysis. We've never been trained to do XYZ, and the HR capacity is not there within regulators, or budgets are not there within regulators to carry out regulations in the way that you are asking us to. So since you've been involved with FOIR for such a long time and have been talking to various regulators, it'll be really interesting to hear your views on how do you build regulatory capacity such that both existing regulators benefit, and when you set up something as ambitious as the DPA or any other regulator that you may set up, we learn, we put in these processes right from day one. So what would be your thoughts on improving regulatory capacity?
Thank you, Renuka. So beginning with, just adding on to what Anirudh said and what all the speakers have talked about, we are talking about over-regulation, under-regulation. Now, I think this is a time to sort of pause and also talk about self-regulation, because the concept of self-regulation will also help in in sort of diluting the complexity of the range of things that the DPA has to look into, right? Because data protection authority, I mean, it would be like Anirudh said, I completely agree with him that the myriad of things that it has to look into and the kind of tasks that have been given to it, it's humongous. And I don't know, how they'll be, I mean, I wish them luck and I think they will do well. But the point is that the entities also have to be self-regulated. Now, Shubhashir, of course, is from the, from the digital platform, fintech, and all of that. So I think that if the regulators, like the big data, the big four companies, if they were sort of they had shown some restraint, we would not have reached the situation where, I mean, this is a very utopian concept that I'm talking about, self-regulation. But we have seen that if the regulated entities are open, they have compliance mechanisms, they have advocacy for their employees. We train a lot of private sector employees because there are a lot of private entities who are interested in a very competition compliant atmosphere, creating a competition compliance culture in their organization. So we do capacity building for them also. So I think self-regulation is something that the regulated entities could look at, number one. Then coming to your question about capacity building, which of course I'm very much into, and yes, there are those challenges of HR. The HR is not either they are very fresh or the regulator itself is very new. So let's say when the IBBI was set up, it's a fairly new regulator, only about 5+ years old. They found that there are very few insolvency professionals. So then they went ahead, and now there is a graduate insolvency professionals program that is run. They are creating insolvency professionals, and I think they completed 5 years. And with the COVID and the pandemic situation happening, the rate of insolvency grew exponentially high, which was never really they never really envisaged that when the IBBI was set up. So just as an example, number one, what can be done is that there are also government departments. There is a staff crunch. There's always, of course, we have seen that the person heading a regulator is usually a retired bureaucrat. So as is the narrative, they're generalists, so to speak. And when they're, of course, masters of their trade, but the fact is that, you have to be very specific. You have to be very, very subject oriented. And then you have to run the show. And of course, with the dynamic market that is happening, you have to understand what is your statute. You have to understand what are your powers, your duties, and the day-to-day challenges that exist. So within that framework, the HR capacity has to be built up. And yes, that is a challenge. Most of them do have a training mandate, which they get fulfilled. But most of it, I must also say, usually the capacity building mandate falls short of what is actually required. Places like IICA try to fill it as to the best of our capabilities. Budgeting is always a constraint. Budget for HR capacity building activities, we find, either they are so busy with the tasks that are given to them that this area is usually neglected. So sometimes we have to knock at their doors and say that, this is an area This is a very upcoming area, especially the digital platform markets. There's very little awareness. Your staff needs at every level, that your staff needs training on this. We do extensive trainings on AI and blockchain also, because most regulators are entering this sphere. They need to understand, their staff needs to understand, even at the advisor level and at the chairperson level. They need to understand these new technologies. I think earlier there was a question also on technology. So yes, there is a lot of capacity building happening also, Renuka. It's not like, this is the thought that is crossing only this panel's mind. The regulators are, sort of strengthening their HR capacities with latest knowledge. There is knowledge sharing across different countries that is happening. And then, of course, I would again like to, at the cost of repetition, talk about regulators talking to each other. So we have held colloquiums which have been extremely successful, where we have had the top sectoral chairpersons talking to each other, conversing with each other, and coming up with fabulous, white papers as well as draft ideas, which we have gone ahead with. So I think those are commonalities and common platforms where these regulators can come together and create a huge, efficient HR pool for the regulators, not only for their own functioning, but to help each other, because there's always this movement of staff that happens between regulators also.
Renuka, I would like to come in with a point, which
Please.
is, again, just from a, having now seen the belly of the beast, is bringing a little bit of kind of pragmatism to this, right? Which is, how do most regulated entities operate? They will multiply the probability of getting caught by the fine that you pay on getting caught. And that's how they decide really which regulation they must meet, which regulations are good to meet, and which regulation they're just going to take the regulatory risk of ever getting caught, right? Now let's talk about the DPA. What the DPA, even in kind of European countries with a lot more state capacity, you see that they're just anyway, struggling under the weight of how much they're supposed to regulate. Apart from Germany, where the regulation and the DPA level happens at a kind of subnational level, all of them really focus on these one or two large cases at a time, and therefore, look kind of, that's what they as regulators are optimizing for. So the large underbelly of different regulated entities really think about that, it is highly unlikely that the regulator is ever going to go behind me, because they're so busy taking on the big guys in the room. So from that perspective, therefore, what is important for regulators, especially of the nature of the DPA, which is really large and expansive, is let's give them a very, very narrow mandate, which they can enforce really well. And in the process of enforcing it through the regular checks and balances, they start building capacity. So let's not assume capacity, let's induce capacity by giving them a limited, transparent mandate to which they can be held accountable. Once they start demonstrating that they are actually capable of handling that and do not impose costs on the economy, then you start giving them more and more power. So progressive expansion of the scope of a regulator is what we as a country should be thinking about. I think the general default mechanism we currently have is, let's put all possible eventualities. Let's try to deal with it through this parent legislation, which also therefore introduces a lot of discretion with the regulator. So I think that's what we need to do, especially for regulators of this nature.
Thanks, Shubhashish. I see that we are running out of time, and there are two questions. So I'm going to ask those two questions and then hand over to each of you for closing remarks, which I will request you to keep very short. So these are general questions. They're not specifically targeted at any one person. So please feel free to answer them if you like. So the first question is there regulatory overreach by the government in India, and has the goal of minimum government and maximum governance translated into any on-ground changes? So would someone like to take that?
May I take this in the context of the Competition Commission?
Please.
Yes. So I feel that the CCI, so to speak, has been extremely careful, cautious, only stepping in as and when required. And again, some very landmark cases that you've seen in the recent 6 months or so pertaining to the big be it Flipkart, be it Google, be it so many others. So I feel that there has been sort of a balance that has been maintained. I've already talked about IBBI earlier. So I do feel that over-regulation is, in my opinion, in most sectors, certainly not happening. There might be corrections that are required as far as the processes are concerned to make it more conducive for the regulated entities to understand the basic and the large, the eventual goals of the regulator, be it any regulator. However, I don't think there is an overreach of regulation as of now in the current economic scenario, and especially considering the fact that within the COVID, the 2 years that the entire world has gone through, there have been so many orders, circulars, regulations that have sort of diluted the initial mandate of most regulators to make it conducive for a very for a robust growth as well as for a robust existence to happen, because it's been a case of survival for a lot of companies, for a lot of entities, regulated entities. And I do feel maybe it is not enough. I'm not saying the regulators have been perfect, but I'm just saying that since I'm also doing a research on various regulators, how they've coped up and how they've responded in the COVID-19 pandemic era, what I have found as of now, and the report will be out in a few months, is that they have risen to the challenge to the best of their capabilities, as much as they could. And of course, there's always more to be done in the government. There's never enough. Nothing is enough. But over-regulation is a term that I would not use in the current context. Please feel free to disagree.
Okay, I think we'll, since we are running out of time, I'm going to move on to the next question, which is that the government has decided to levy a 30% tax on gains from virtual digital assets, but there is still uncertainty about any regulatory regime. What can the consumer protection provisions in place be so that smaller investors are not hurt? Any takers for this question?
I can maybe just make a quick remark. I think honestly, it's the opposite of what we've been discussing so far, which is that no regulator wants to touch it. They want someone to regulate it, but RBI doesn't want to do it. SEBI doesn't want to do it because it's going to be a minefield, whoever terrain it lands up in. I think from a consumer protection perspective, the RBI, I think at least for the past 6-7 years, has been consistently issuing press releases to say, do not invest in virtual currencies, or if you be very cautious, all of that. And of course, as all of us know, when they did take the next step, which is to protect consumers, to say that banks cannot enter into any transactions with them, that was struck down by the Supreme Court. So I think from a consumer protection context, it's a great question. And, it's one of those funny things that people say that, you ask the lawmakers, is this allowed or not? And then they come back with a tax percentage. So nobody knows if it's allowed or not, but you do know that you have to pay tax on it. From a consumer protection standpoint, I think the sense seems to be that it's going to be regulated as a security by SEBI. But I think we'll have to wait to see the details when the bill is tabled and made public.
So thanks, Vivek. A lot of sort of discussions and questions that have arisen in the context of today, starting from what independence actually means and whether it is sort of used to take accountability away, the question of intersectoral coordination between regulators, building of regulatory capacity, better processes in regulation making, how to do better enforcement. So I think there have been a lot of conversations today on each of these points, which I hope we are able to take forward in building better regulators and improving the functioning of existing regulators in the coming years. So I think we'll end with sort of a quick closing comment by each of you. So Abha, like less than a minute.
Closing comment as well as one recommendation.
Yep. So Abha, let's begin with you. Your closing comment and one recommendation.
Yes. So Well, all that I think we've had this discussion, a pre-discussion also, and thank you, Renuka, for encapsulating it so well. Yeah, so mainly I think my point would be in the area that I'm working closely, that, we need, I think, more discussions definitely to happen, because what is happening at the ground level is really that the regulator, I find, is so focused, with these blinders on the sector, which is good, of course, but sometimes the regulator is over focused, and he or she, it fails to see left and right. So it's just, moving on at great speed without looking at the macro view. So I think one would really need to sort of, take a step backwards. And like I said, the first point that I raised about cross-sectoral regulators, that, you find some commonalities in all the statutes. You'll find some commonalities that all regulators have. So should we, and also this point about quasi-judicial powers that some regulators have and some don't, some would like, some think it is an overreach. So should there be a set pattern for set standard, I would say, for regulators across the country? I think we need a rethink on that. Then I think a very pertinent point and a recommendation, so to speak, is that do we need to have, and Anirudh, of course, has worked extensively on this, do we need to have performance indicator mechanisms? Do we need to not regulate, but sort of assess the performance of our regulators? There is the usual mechanism. There are the annual reports. There are the budgets that are placed before the parliament. There are like I said, the financial report that is presented before the parliament. But beyond that, the mandate of a regulator, whether it is being fulfilled, whether it is sort of rising to the need, and especially with the dynamic times that we are in, who looks at or who assesses the performance of a regulator? It cannot be another supra body above the regulator, so that there's one assessing body, now we have a new body. I'm not at all in favor of that. But then what is the solution to that? I think that is a larger question I'd like to leave the panel with. Thank you.
Anirudh?
So I think I definitely agree there are a lot of problems with how regulators are functioning today. There are definitely cases and instances of overreach, overactivism, being too quick to regulate. And I think there is need for greater evidence in decision making, greater transparency, and so on. I do want to temper the discussion with the point that we should remember what markets were like before we had regulators in a lot of these markets. People who worked in financial markets remember what the stock market and the securities market was like before SEBI, and what the telecom market was like before TRAI. So we do need to understand that regulators have made improvements to these markets in many cases, and these have been a strategic decision to create some kind of a technocratic regulation or a regulatory making process. To those who say that government departments could have done this as well, I think the evidence is pretty clear that government departments could not have done this and were not able to do this. So we created regulators in many cases out of necessity, and rather than a lack of, rather than a question of choice. So I think we do need to keep that in mind when we talk about problems with regulators. We should not try to dismantle the entire idea of independent regulators when we are talking about how to improve the quality of regulation making and to improve regulatory practices in general. The other point is that we do need to think about how we define the mandate and objectives of regulators, because I think that's a central problem that then underlies how regulators function. When we give them broad mandates, expansive mandates, unclear objectives, when we tell them your job is to protect investors without any clarity on how that protection is supposed to take place, what are the aspects you're supposed to protect them from, they are going to be failures in judgment and decision making and so on. and excesses as well. So we need to think much more about the objectives and the clarity in the mandate that we give to regulators. Thank you.
Vivek?
Thanks, Renuka. I think just I think a quick summary I think would be that we should take the work of regulators more seriously. I think it doesn't end with the legislation being passed. I think there's a lot left to do after the legislation is passed as well. And I think one recommendation from my end would be that to really ramp up our efforts in terms of capacity building for regulators, because the element of discretion for regulators is here to stay. We can tinker with it, we can improve on it, but there's always going to remain some discretion and some regulation making responsibility or quasi-judicial responsibility with regulators. So what we should do is really ramp up efforts to train the people who are doing this to do their jobs better. And I think that's something that's a bit more, that's both constructive, and we find that regulators are quite receptive to it as well. So thanks everyone for a great discussion.
Shubhashish?
I know we are out of time and most of the things have already been said. I will just say this, that I think one of the quick fixes, not quick fixes, but one of the good fixes might be to make sure that the boards of these regulators actually have people who have experience in being regulated, because then they will really understand the pushes and pulls of meeting these regulations. So I'll add that on top of everything that's already been said.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So quick summary of the 4 recommendations. We need to define the mandate and objective of the regulator more carefully. Have metrics to assess the performance of the regulator so that we are continuously giving the regulator some feedback on how it's doing. Have better boards so that the boards can also guide the functioning of the regulators, and ramp efforts in capacity building so that regulators can continue to do their job better. Thank you all for a very interesting discussion, and I hope that this plays a part in improving the regulatory environment in India. Thank you.
Well, it's been a fantastic discussion. Particular thanks to Renuka, to you, for putting it together with such absolutely fantastic and phenomenal minds together, coming from different fields and giving their perspective. And this area could be as diverse as anything, and keeping the discussion focused, sustaining it for 90 minutes and coming up with recommendations, very well steered. So thank you particularly to you for putting this together. And thank you to all the panelists for speaking from your heart and being candid on the platform, because the beauty of the platform is capturing this diverse wisdom and then putting it together. So Renuka, can I request you for one thing? If you could, you've done it so well. Could you put together 700-800 words on this with maybe 7-8 recommendations that have come out of this?
It's very difficult that you are asking me live. So let's discuss this after the call.
All right, great. So good. Right. So thank you all very much. And I look forward to interacting with you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.